We're in Rabbi Yosef and Shraga and Avram Ben Esther.
Amen.
We need to
Okay, Rabbi Isai, we're on DAF Chaf Vav Amud Aleph at the Mishnah, and we've been talking about different types of things that are acquired through different mechanisms, and now we're going to be talking about real estate and chattel in animate objects. Up until now, we've been talking about animate objects. So the Mishnah says, "Nachasim sheish lahem achrayas niknem bekesef uvishtar v'chazaka." That real estate, what's called sheish lahem achrayas, simply because it is property that has a greater sense of security for a buyer. If a buyer purchases a piece of real estate and the property turns out to be encumbered, so then the buyer has legal recourse. Anyway, it's called sheish lahem achrayas. There's a, like Rashi says, she'achrayas kol adam shalove v'nosha b'chaver aleihem lefi shekayamim va'omdim. That also when you lend people money, and you lend people money using real estate as collateral, there's a greater sense of security as well, right? So that's why they're called sheish lahem achrayas. There's a greater level of depth or gravitas to them. So real estate can be acquired through kesef, shtar, and chazaka. Three methods: cash, contract, or physical signs of acquisition, where you go and you do work either on the perimeter or do digging on the soil itself. But property that is chattel, that is not real estate, so then that can only be acquired through physically pulling it. Now, the Gemara does not take into account chalipin over here. Chalipin is an alternate method in all of these cases, but it seems to be like on a separate track. Nechasim she'ein lahem achrayas niknem in nechasim she'esh lahem achrayas bekesef uvishtar v'chazaka. Now we have something called a kinyan agav, which means that it is possible that if a person is being sold a package of both real estate and chattel, then since you're acquiring the real estate with kesef, shtar, and chazaka, that method of kinyan will also help with the chattel that is being acquired together with the real estate. And finally, similarly, if a claim is made in court for a combined claim of both real estate and chattel, then the chattel can cause, through its connection to the real estate, can cause a person to take an oath over real estate. Normally, ein nishpoyan lekarkos, there's a general rule that a person cannot be forced to take an oath when it comes to court cases over exclusively real estate. But if the court case is both over real estate and chattel, the claimant can force the defendant to take a vow not only over the chattel, but also over the real estate as well. The Gemara now says, Bekesef minolan. How do you know that kesef is a valid method of acquisition for real estate? Amar Chizkiya, Amar Kra, because we have a pasuk in Sefer Yirmiyah which describes Jews purchasing land in Eretz Yisrael. Sados ba'kesef yiknu. It says that fields they shall acquire with cash. Ve'ema adi ikashtar. But one second, if that's your source text, the pasuk you have to read it a little bit more, and it says Dechsiv v'chasov b'sefer v'chasom. That it says that after purchasing with cash, they have to also record it in a contract. So perhaps you need both in order for a deal to be consummated. The Gemara says, "Iksiv yiknu lebasov kideka amar tasha dechsiv yiknu meikara kesef kani shtar raya ba'almahu." So the Gemara says, if the structure of the sentence was, they shall give cash and write it in a shtar in order to acquire, then I would agree with you. You would need both. That would be the import of the pasuk. But because the pasuk says they shall purchase with cash and then record in a shtar, that implies that the shtar is not the mechanism of acquisition, but rather it is there to provide evidence of an acquisition that was done through the mechanism of cash alone. Amar Rav lo shanu ela b'makom she'en kosven es ashtar, avol b'makom shekosven es ashtar lo kana. So Rav tells us a big chiddush. He says it's true that cash is a mechanism for purchasing real estate, but only in a vacuum. If you live in a community where the norms of real estate purchase always require a contract, so then just because the buyer put down money does not automatically make him the owner. Because since both the buyer and the seller have a reliance based on the norms of the community, of that culture, to sign a contract, then the seller does not relinquish the property psychologically until the contract is signed and delivered. And the same thing, the buyer does not feel a sense of acquisition until he acquires the deed of sale, until he acquires the actual writ. The parish parish. And furthermore, says the Gemara, that even if you live in a community where the standard is contract sales, that the buyer has to be given a deed of sale, if the buyer wants to stipulate at the outset, saying that I reserve the right to choose the mechanism whereby this land deal will be consummated. If I want it to be consummated through cash, I reserve that right. And if I want it to be consummated through delivery of the deed, I reserve that right as well. Ki hada Ravidi bar Abin ki zavin ara omar ibaina bekaspa ikni ibaina bishtara ikni. And we have a rabbi who used to do that. Rav Idi was a big real estate guy, and when he would make deals, he would specifically state at the outset to the seller, he says, I'm willing to buy this property, but on the condition that I get to decide at the time whether I want the mechanism of kesef to create the sale or whether the shtar is going to create the sale. Now, why would he change his mind? What was it? What was in it for him? So, ibaina bekaspa ikni di ibaisu lemihader lamotzisu hadrisu, the ibaina b'shtara ikni di ibaina lemihader hadrana bi. You know, when you dabble in real estate, you know that there are certain deals that are great deals, and there are certain deals that are a little bit more risky. So, if he saw a really solid, excellent deal, he wanted to reserve the right to put down the cash and say, we have a done deal. There's no backing out. I don't even need to wait for the deed, right? But if there was a deal that was a little bit more speculative and risky and the market was fluctuating, he would put down money, but he would tell the seller, the deal's not done until we exchange the deed of sale. Because that way he would always have the right to back out and demand his money back. So he was a very shrewd businessman, that he would decide the terms of the sale at the outset, specifying that I get to decide. Uvishtar, the next method of purchase is shtar, is by a contract or deed, like we use that word. Minol, and how do we know this? He says, you can't use the pasuk in Yirmiyah that we tried to use before, because we established based on the sentence structure there that the mechanism was kesef over there. It wasn't shtar. The shtar was only there for evidence of the sale. So ela mehacha. But rather we have a different pasuk earlier in the very same parak in Sefer Yirmiyah. It says vo'ekacha Sefer Hamikna, that Yirmiyah says that I took the scroll of purchase, which means that there was a writ of purchase that Yirmiyahu Hanavi was dealing with that indicates that the mechanism of purchase was the scroll itself. Omar Shmuel lo shanu elo bishtar matana avol b'mecher lo kana ad she'itein lo damim. And Shmuel here tells us a very big chiddush, and he says that the only time the delivery of the deed alone is a valid mechanism of sale is only when the real estate is being transferred as a gift and there's no price attached to the transfer. But when money has to be paid for the real estate, so then the deal is not consummated until the money exchanges from the buyer to the seller, even if the seller already delivered the deed. That's a huge chiddush, because it doesn't seem that way from the Mishnah, but Shmuel is saying no. Shtar is the only time shtar is the mechanism is when it's a matana, not when it's a mecher, not when it's a sale. So Masav Rav Hamnuna. So Rav Hamnuna brings a brisa that seems to refute that, because it says b'shtar kates ad kasav lo al anir o al acheres afal pish ein bahem shava pruta sadi mechura lach sadi nasuna lach hareza mechura unasuna. It says that if a person writes on a piece of paper or on a shard of pottery, even if that shard is not worth even a shava pruta, as long as the seller writes, this property is hereby sold to Ploni, and he delivers it to Ploni, then it doesn't matter whether he says it's sold to Ploni or it's given to Ploni as a gift. That in itself consummates the deal. So you see very clearly from the brisa that a shtar can be used both for gifts and for sales. The Gemara answers, "Hu mosiv la v'hu mefarik la." So Rav Hamnuna raised the brisa, and he was able to reconcile it as follows: B'mocher sadehu mipnei ra'asa. There, it's talking about a person who's selling a field that is in distress, In other words, what was the whole reason that Shmuel said that when a person sells his field, he doesn't consummate the deal until he gets the money? Because you look at the psychology of a seller. The psychology of a seller is, I have no problem giving you the deed of sale, but until I get the money in my bank account, I have no assurance that you're a solid buyer, and I don't really have the gemar das, the psychological determination to relinquish ownership of the property to you. But that's only true in regular sales. When you're selling distressed real estate, where it's very hard to find a buyer and you just need to unload it right away. So in that situation, the psychology of the seller is, and Basin would have to make this determination, the psychology of the seller is, you're willing to take the deed and sign on the dotted line? Good, done. You'll get me the money when you get me the money. But I just want to unload this property and make sure that you owe me the money. Okay, so that's the reason why dafka over there it works. Ravashi Omar b'matana bikesh lo litna lo v'lama kasav lo lashon mecher k'dei liyafas is kocho. And Ravashi says, no. The way I would explain the Bryce according to Shmuel is not that it's saying that both sales and gifts can be consummated through a shtar, but rather only gifts can be consummated through a shtar. Why then did the seller write, my field is hereby sold to you, if it's really only being given as a gift? Because he wants to be called bimiyafikoch. He wants to upgrade the power of the recipient of the gift. I give a guy a gift of a field, and I want to reassure him that if my creditors come and seize the field, don't worry. You're not going to have to worry about all the investments that you put in the field. I promise you that even if my creditors seize the field that I've given you as a gift, you will be able to always come after me to recoup the loss of the field, because I'll put in the shtar that I sold it to you. When I say that I sold it to you, that means that you have out-of-pocket expenses. Even if I gave it to you as a gift, I'm sort of upgrading your power of collection. If I give you a gift and my creditors come and they take it, well, easy come, easy go, right? You didn't put out any money for it, so you can't come after me by saying, hey, I didn't sell you anything. I gave it to you as a gift, so, easy come, easy go. My creditors took it, sorry, right? But if I write down that I sold it to you, that says that there was out-of-pocket expenses for you, even when there weren't, and that gives you the right to come after me in Basin and collect the value of the property. And that's why a person would write that even when he's doing it as a gift. Okay, so therefore this brisa is not a challenge to Shmuel. It could be that shtar alone only works by matana and not by mecher, not by sales. Uve chazaka. And the third method is through chazaka, where a person physically demonstrates ownership by working the land, planting on it, or putting up a fence and so forth. Minol, and how do we know this? So Amar Chizkiya, Amar Kra, V'shavu be'areichem asher tifastem. So there's a pasuk, and this pasuk is also in Yirmiyah, but in a different parak, where Yehoshaphat is giving property over to his children, and he says, they shall dwell in their cities that they have taken hold of. And so the way we understand that, there's two verbs, bametafastem b'yeshiva. How do you take hold, how do you take possession of a property? By dwelling on it as an owner. That in itself demonstrates ownership. Devei Rabbi Yishmael Tana v'yirishtem osa v'yishavtem ba. Bameh yirashtem b'yeshiva. He says, and the Devei Rabbi Yishmael says, you can learn it from a pasuk in Chumash. It says, you shall inherit the land and you shall dwell in it. How do you inherit? How do you take possession? By dwelling. By dwelling in a property, you demonstrate bailus, you demonstrate ownership of it, and that in itself is a valid method of kinyan. That's what the word says. It doesn't seem that way. It doesn't seem that way that there's a period of time. Now, of course, when we get to Maseches Bava Basra and we get to Cheskes Sabatim, we'll talk about when property is contested. But that's a whole different issue. See, there's an issue, number one, of how do you make the initial kinyan to create transfer of ownership. That is a momentary demonstration of dwelling. But how do you prove ownership? If your claim of ownership is contested, that's what's called a chazaka, where you have to live on a property for 3 years. Okay, let's go on. Now, v'she'ein lahem achrayus ein niknan ela b'mishicha. Now, we had seen that property that is chattel can only be acquired through pulling it, through physically pulling it towards yourself. Minalan, how do we know this? Because the Torah says when you sell something, to your friend, or you purchase something from the hand of your friend. So the word hand is the key word. It's there to teach me davar hanikna miyad liyad, that in order to acquire something from your friend, it has to be transferred physically from his hand to your hand, which is the act of Mashiach. So that only works out if you hold that the method of transfer is a physical transfer of the chattel from seller to buyer. But Rabbi Yochanan doesn't learn that way. According to Rabbi Yochanan, let's say the seller wants to sell a bushel of wheat. According to Rabbi Yochanan, midioraisa, as soon as the buyer gives $100 for the bushel of wheat, he becomes the owner without even having to do Mashiach. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, how does he reconcile that with our Mishnah? So the Gemara answers, Tana takanta de Rabbanan katani. According to Rabbi Yochanan, our Mishnah is telling us the rabbinic addendum to the biblical law. Biblically, Rabbi Yochanan agrees that, and the Mishnah agrees, that the method of kinyan is cash and Mashiach is not necessary. But rabbinically, the rabbis, in addition to that, required Mashiach. Why is that? So when we learn Bava Metzia, we'll learn all about this. It's because of the claim of Shema Yomar Nisrafu Chitecha Ba'aliyah. What's that case? A seller sells a bushel of wheat to the buyer. The buyer gives him $100, and he says, okay, tomorrow I'm going to come pick up the wheat from your warehouse. The following morning, when he comes to pick up the wheat, the seller tells him, oh, I'm so sorry, the warehouse burned down. Your investment was lost. So the buyer says, well, give me back my money. Why should I give you back your money? It was your wheat that burned down. It wasn't my wheat. You already purchased it. So therefore, the rabbis required that the buyer has to take delivery, has to do Mashiach in order for the sale to be final. Until the buyer has taken delivery of the goods, the sale is not final. You can appreciate this. This is all about commodities, right? That you deal in all the time. Has this ever happened to you?
Yeah. And like something, and the next day someone ought to be much cheaper, his competitor, and he wouldn't match the price.
And you had already put down the money?
I put a deposit. Yeah.
And what happened?
I walked because even with the deposit it was cheaper.
Okay. All right.
No insurance?
Okay. Weiter.
There's no
All right.
insurance.
Nechasim she'ein lahem achrayus.
No insurance.
No, well, when you sign it, what Moshe's case is not really exactly our situation. No, there's no insurance. That's the whole reason that the insurance is why Chazal stepped in. They said there has to be, that the sale is not final until you take delivery. Okay. Nechasim she'ein lahem achrayus. Then we had said that if you have chattel and real estate that's being sold as a bundle, then you can use the mechanism of acquisition for real estate, and that'll work for the metaltalin as well. That'll work for the chattel as well. So therefore, for example, if a guy's buying a field and he's buying a cow, so then he can make a kinyan with kesef on the field, and that same mechanism of kesef will work for the cow as well. So minahani mili, how do we know this? So Amar Chivskiya da Amar Kra, Vayiten, I'm sorry, this is the pasuk with Yehoshaphat, not the previous pasuk. Vayiten lamaviyah matanos, that Yehoshaphat gave his children gifts, im arei mitzuros b'Yehuda, together with cities that were fortified in Judea. So what the pasuk implies is that whatever method they used to acquire the cities in Judea was the method they used to acquire the gifts. So ibayilahu ba'inan svurim olo. So a very, very basic practical question is, does the chattel have to be resting on the real estate in order for the kinyan on the real estate to work for the chattel as well? Or could Bessie the cow be in Markham and the real estate is in Vaughan, and as long as you're buying them together, it's perfectly valid? That's the question. So Amar Rav Yosef Tashma, he says, come and listen. Rabbi Akiva Omer Karka Kol Shehu Chayeves Bepeya Uva Bikurim, that there's a brisa that says like this, that the smallest piece of property, no matter how tiny it is, will still be subject to the laws of Peya, that if you grow anything on that property, you have to leave a corner of it for the poor. Uvibikurim, and you have to bring first fruits from it. In other words, there's no minimal size of that the property has to be. V'lichtov aleha pruzbol, and also we remember from the laws of Shemitah that the only time that a lender can use a pruzbol to extend his loan beyond Shemitah is if the person that borrowed money from him owns property. That's the only time pruzbol will work. So even if the borrower only has a tiny piece of property, that's enough for the principal to work. And finally, this is the key point, and you can use even a tiny piece of property to create a kinyan both for the real estate and for the chattel that's going to be sold together, to be bundled together with it. So the question is like this: and if you're going to tell me that the chattel has to be resting on the real estate for the kinyan to work, how can you have chattel on a tiny piece of real estate? How is it going to rest on a tiny piece? So the Gemara says, Targuma Rav Shmuel Bar Bisna Kamei Rav Yosef Kegon Shino Atzba Machat. Yes, it's true. Let's say you have a needle. You want to sell a needle together with a piece of real estate. You can stick the needle in a tiny little piece of property that's even just an inch by an inch, and stick it in there, and then whatever method you use to acquire the inch by inch piece of property can be used to acquire the needle as well. So the Gemara now says, Amalei Rav Yosef Kavastan Ichbal Tana Lashminan Machat. So Rav Yosef says, you're annoying me. He says, you think that the Tana would write a whole brisa or a Mishnah just to teach me the law of selling a needle? Come on, what's wrong with you? So Amar Rav Ashi, Man leimulan delo talab Amar Genisa de Shavi Alfa Zuze. So Rav Ashi says, what's Rav Yosef's problem? Sometimes the tiniest little commodity can be worth thousands of dollars. Let's say the guy wants to sell a precious pearl, and he wants to sell it via real estate. So he would take a tiny little piece of real estate that's only an inch by an inch, put the pearl on top of the real estate. Maybe that's taka b'halacha. Maybe the pearl has to be resting on the real estate in order for the kinyan on the real estate to help for the pearl. So the pearl could be worth 1,000 zuz. So therefore, that's not such a contrived situation. Tashma, Amar Rabbi Lazar, Maisa b'madoni echad shahaya b'Yerushalayim, shahaylo metaltalin harbe, uvikesh litnam b'matana. So let's look at the following story. Rabbi Lazar says there was once a fellow from the town of Madon. He was in Yerushalayim for a visit, and he had a huge amount of metaltalin assets, of chattel, and he wanted to give it as a gift to, I guess his favorite Kohen, his favorite rabbi, whatever it was in Yerushalayim. So Amru lo, ein lo takana. I just heard a story. There's a Chabad in New Jersey that was just built. The person who donated the money died and he gave $30 million to build the Chabad Center and $10 million to the rabbi. So we should all be so lucky. So Amrulo, you never know, Moshe. Amrulo, ein lo takana. So he said, there's no remedy to do this. Ad sheyikneim al gabe karka. So the only way to make a kinyan to your favorite Kohen is you're going to have to make a kinyan on real estate because the chattel's not here. So ma asa halach v'lokach beis sela samach liYerushalayim. So what he did is he bought a piece of real estate the size of a sela, which is a coin, right? So he takes the tiniest little piece of real estate. Va'amar tzvoni zeh liploni. The Mon May he says this northern piece of property belongs to Ploni, and together with that property he's going to acquire 100 sheep and 100 barrels of wine. So what do you see from that story? There's no way you're going to get 100 sheep on top of that little coin-sized piece of property. So Umeis v'kimos dvarvin, the guy died and the rabbis upheld his kinyan. So v'yamart b'inan svurim ba beisela l'may chazi. If you're going to tell me that you need the chattel to be on the real estate, how's that possible in that scenario? So the Gemara says, "Mi savras beisela sela mamish, my sela denafish tuva, v'may kori leisela dekashi kesela." So the Gemara says you misunderstood the story. When we said that he bought a piece of real estate of a sela, you thought that the word sela means the size of a coin. That's not what it means. It was a big plot of land. Why is it called a sela plot? Because the word sela doesn't just mean coin, it means rock. And it was rocky terrain, which is why he was able to get such a good price for it, because it couldn't be used for agriculture. And therefore he bought a big lot of rocky land in order to create the kinyan by bringing all of his sheep on top of the property and all of the other chattel. And that's what possibly could have happened. So you have no raya from there. Tashma d'Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Ma'isa ba'adam echad shechala b'Yerushalayim karabel Eliezer, v'amri la bari haya karabanan. So it's not clear whether this is the same story or whether it's a different story or it's just a different version of the same story. There was once a Maisa about a man who either, and it's not clear what happened, either he was very sickly, and he could have even been on his deathbed, but we paskined in that case like Rabbi Eliezer, who says that even if you're a shchiv meirav, even if you're on your deathbed, you have to do a formal kinyan. Or the story could have been where the guy was perfectly healthy, and that's why he needed to do a complete kinyan in order to transfer ownership. Shahaylo metaltalin harbe ubikesh litnam b'matana. He had a lot of chattel, and he wanted to transfer them over to his favorite Kohen, Rabbi, as a gift. So Amrulo ein lo takana ad sheyiknem al gabe karka. They said to him, we're sorry, the only way that you're going to be able to transfer this is through a kinyan together with real estate. So ma'asa halach v'lokach beis rova samach li Yerushalayim v'omar tefach al tefach li ploni v'imo meyatzonu mea chavuyos. And he said, okay, so he bought a piece of property, and he said that this one little swath of that property, which is one tefach by one tefach, I hereby gift to my friend Ploni, and together with that gift, with my friend Ploni, right, I'm giving him 100 sheep and 100 barrels of wine. And that's why he was able to transfer ownership. And then umeis v'kimo chachamim es devarav, and he died, and the chachamim upheld his kinyan. So the question is like this: V'yamart ba'inon sevurim tefach al tefach l'may chazi. There it says explicitly it was one tefach by one tefach, 4 inches by 4 inches. You can't even get one goat on that property, right? So how could he transfer 100 sheep and 100 barrels of wine? So the Gemara answers, no, you did misunderstood. Hacha b'mayaskinon lidemei. He didn't say, I'm giving him 100 sheep and 100 barrels. I'm giving him the cash equivalent of 100 sheep and 100 barrels. So you can take a whole big stack of gold coins or gold bullion and stack them on top of a piece of property that's very, very small. That's maybe what happened. And therefore, it could be that taka, you do need the metaltalin to rest on the karka in order for the kinyan to work. So the Gemara says, "Hachanami mistavra the isal kadaitach meyatzonu meyachavuyos mamish nikninu nihalei bechalipin." And the Gemara says it only stands to reason. It's reasonable what you're saying, because if you're going to tell me that Hitaka had literally 100 sheep and 100 barrels, then why didn't he just use the method of chalipin to give to the kohen, right? Why did he have to? Fine, you can't do mashicha, but at least do chalipin. So the Gemara says ve'elamai lidemei nikninu nihalei b'mashicha. So the Gemara says, well then what are you telling me? Oh, so that indicates that it has to have been cash. Well, for cash, you have a simple solution as well. Let the kohen make and do an act of mashicha on all those gold coins. What's the big deal? If there's a bag of gold coins, let him do mashicha on them. So ela delese lemekabel matana, chanami delese lemekabel matana. So therefore, the Gemara says you really have no indication whatsoever. Either way, the reason why there's no mashicha and there's no chalipin is for one very simple reason. The kohen who's receiving the gift was not available. He wasn't present. He was somewhere else. He was out of town. He went away, whatever it was. But the bottom line is that this guy wanted to give a gift before he died to this kohen, and he wasn't available. So they told him the only method available to you is to make a kinyan on real estate and to be mezakeh it to someone. Let someone on behalf of this guy make a kinyan on the real estate. So frak the Gemara v'niskinu nihalei agav acher. But why was it necessary to do it that way? If you're going to have to make the kinyan through a third party, then why not just give the coins or the sheep and have someone else make a kinyan mashicha on those items on behalf of the other guy? So the Gemara says, Lo samcha daite savar shamit va'achilahu. The gifter was a very untrusting, suspicious person, and he was fearful that if I do it that way, then what's going to happen is the guy will run away with the chattel. I don't trust him, so therefore I'm going to keep the chattel in my warehouse. I'll let the third party make a kinyan on the real estate on behalf of my friend, and by making a kinyan on the real estate, it'll also be kind of the chattel as well. Ve'elamai ein lo takana. So then why did the rabbis tell him that there's no remedy? There is a remedy. You can do chalipin, you can do mashicha. That's not true. So hachi kamer lamai de lo samcha daite ein lo takana ad sheyiknem al gabe karka. No, what they meant to tell him was that for you, who's a suspecting individual, an untrusting individual, the only way that it'll work work because you're not willing to relinquish it to a third party is to make a kinyan through real estate. So Tashma, let's look at the next story. Ma'isa b'Rabban Gamliel u'zakenim shayu boim basfina. Rabbi Gamliel was once traveling with a group of other sages on a boat. All of a sudden, Rabbi Gamliel remembers something. He remembers, I left a whole bunch of grain in my barn that I hadn't yet done Trumas and Maasros for. And I know that a person can never leave in his possession untithed produce. So he wanted to fix it, but he wasn't there. What is he going to do? So Amar lahem Rabban Gamliel azekeinim iser shani asid lamud nasan lo liyahoshua umakomo muskar lo. The iser acher shani asid lamud nasan lo la'akiva ben Yosef kidei sheyizka bo la'aniyim umakomo muskar lo. So what did he do? He says, look, I'm designating a certain chelek, a certain portion of that grain that's in my barn, should go, 10% of that should go to Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, who is a Levi. And he's there on the boat. And he says, okay, Rabbi Yeshua, I want you to be koine the real estate that the grain is resting upon, so that you can acquire the grain. And that way it'll be tithed, the meiser will have been tithed properly. And like Rashi says, Rabbi Yoshua gave him a pruta. He was on the boat with him. He gave him a pruta. And he said, okay, I become now the renter of the real estate, and I thereby acquire the chattel that is together with it. And then Rabbi Gamliel said, okay, I want to do the same thing for the second tithe. This year was either the third year or the sixth year of the Shemitah cycle, in which case the second tithe is Meiser Ani, not Meiser Sheni. And he turns to Rabbi Akiva, he says, Rabbi Akiva, I want you to acquire the Meiser Ani on behalf of all the Aniyim. Rabbi Akiva said, fine, here's a pruta. I acquire the piece of the barn where that grain is resting upon, together with the grain that's resting upon it. And fine. And Shmamina, but we see from that story, Ba'inan Sevurimba, that you see that you need the chattel to be on the real estate that is being acquired. It can't be independent of it. Isn't that an indicator? So the Gemara says, no, Shaini Hasam ki hechidalo litrachinu. It really could be that it's not necessary to give them the piece of property that's directly under the chattel. But the reason why Rabbi Gamliel did it that way was because he didn't want to burden them with having them be put in a situation where the person who's in charge of the barn would attack them as soon as they got back in town, saying, get your grain out of here, it's occupying too much space. So by giving them the convenience of giving them ownership, or at least temporary ownership of the property that the grain was resting upon, they could take their time and pick it up when it was convenient for them. That's the reason why he did it that way. By the way, just as a matter of course, this is so relevant because when we do mechiras chametz, this is one of the methods of kinyan that we use. We use what's called the kinyan agav, where we tell the Gentile, please acquire the resting places of where all the chametz is currently residing. So if the chametz is residing in Mendel Rubinov's house on what street you live on, Mendel?
Tangreen.
On Tangreen. So I want you to acquire such and such address on Tangreen and specifically in this part of that house where all of Mendel's bread and scotch is currently residing. And concomitant, simultaneously with your acquisition of the real estate, which you're going to give me $1 for, or whatever it is, you will automatically acquire together with that all of the chametz that is resting on that property. So that's called the kinyan agav. When we do that today, that's part of the mechanism that we use for mechiras chametz with the Gentile. Have a wonderful day. KIDDUSHIN.